Hi and welcome to this video. So if you're watching this video right now, you most probably came from my Angular 2 article for beginners. So the goal of this article as well as of this video is to give beginners a bird's eye perspective about what Angular 2 is all about. And hopefully it will serve you as a starting point to further explore Angular 2. So if you've not read the article I wrote, I highly recommend to first check it out. And the link of the article is in the video description. So in the article I had a headline called The 7 Key Concepts Behind Angular 2. And this is something John Papa first highlighted in his talk at ngconf. I think this is a great way for you to visualize the main components that are behind Angular 2, and so you can basically connect them when you are then programming or learning more about Angular 2. So what we are going to do now is to create a simple, probably stupid and also useless application, but the main goal is here to demo some of these concepts such that you can better refer to them and get to know them. So as described in the article, what we are going to do is basically to use the Angular CLI. You can find it at cli.angular.io. And if you haven't installed it already, you can grab it by using the npm install -g angular CLI command. And from then we can then go on and execute different kind of commands like ng-new and create a new application. The main goal of the CLI is basically to help people get started quickly. So they don't have to worry about what is the underlying build system I have to use. They don't have to immediately know all the concepts about SystemJS, about Webpack bundling and that stuff. So great, let's get started. So the commands can be found directly in this reference PDF. So what we will first do is create a new project. So let me switch over to the CLI and execute an ng-new, and let's call our application people demo. So if you hit enter, you see that the CLI is downloading all of the npm packages, and it creates a basic application structure that follows the best practices as well as the official style guide. So now let's cd into the directory the CLI created for us. And here I'm going to spin up Visual Studio Code. By the way, if you don't know it, Visual Studio Code is an open source IDE developed by Microsoft. You can download it at codevisualstudio.com. It runs on OS X, Linux and also Windows, and it is mostly popular due to its great support for TypeScript, which we will use quite intensively here with Angular 2. Awesome, so here we see basically the main structure that has been created by the Angular CLI. So we see the package.json file here with all of the dependencies which we need to run our application, mostly Angular 2 dependencies. And at the time of this recording, it is basically version 2.0 RC1. The CLI also created a couple of npm scripts for us, like for starting the application, for linting it, or for running the tests. Then if you open up the source folder, we basically see our application. So here is also the index.html file that gets loaded when our application starts. We see here the people demo app, which is the root component. If you remember in the article I wrote about the component tree, so this will be the top level component that gets loaded by our Angular application. Then further down we see the SystemJS import. SystemJS is basically a library that allows us to load ES6 modules. And the important part here is basically that system-config.js, which you can find just beneath here in our folder structure. And this is also the place where you eventually have to add third-party libraries. Like if you wanted to include Moment.js or D3 or something, you would go here and add that into the system-config.ts file. Great. Then if we take a look at the application folder there, we see our people demo component, which is our root component. But the more important part here is that main file that gets loaded by SystemJS. So if you open up that main file, this is basically where the Angular 2 application gets bootstrapped. So in fact, at the very top, we see the import from the Angular platform browser dynamic, which is a bootstrap function. And at the very bottom of that file, we see that the bootstrap function gets invoked, and we pass it our top level component, which is our people demo app component. And that component in turn is imported from the ./app. And if we go into that folder, we see an index.ts file, and that index.ts file exports everything which that folder or that module or that part of our application wants to share with the external world. And this is somehow a best practice you should do in your Angular applications. Okay, so what we are mostly interested here now is in the people demo component. So let's switch into that component, and here we see like what a component looks like in Angular 2. At the very top, we see the import from the Angular/core, and we import the component decorator. As we've briefly covered in our article, that decorator adds metadata to that class peopleDemoApp component, such that Angular knows what to do with it. And that class here has the simple title property. And then we have a couple of properties in that decorator. Like here we have the peopleDemoApp, which is the selector, which is what we will use in the HTML page for instantiating our component. Then we have the template URL, which is basically the template Angular should load when that component boots. And here we have simply a visualization of the title. Note the curly braces here. And finally, we have also a styles URL. Like we can provide here a styles file, which in this case is empty, which is scoped to just this component and all of its childs. And this is a very powerful way of encapsulating CSS. Now finally, you might wonder about that module ID at the very top. That is basically a mechanism for letting Angular know where our component is within the application structure, and thus to allow us to use relative paths to our template files, to our CSS files. And if you wouldn't indicate that module ID at the very top, we would basically have to provide a full path to our HTML file. And obviously providing a relative path is much more convenient, especially if we want to refactor our components later on or move them around within our application. Great. So if we want to serve now our application, first of all, let's here split that horizontally such that we have two CLIs. Now, if you want to serve our application, we can either use the ng-serve command, or we can use the npm command that Angular CLI created for us. So like npm start. And as you can see now, the application is being served at localhost 4200. And now if we fire up a browser and open it up at that URL, we see that the people application works, like the title is printed out, which we have seen before. Awesome. So let's create a new component. First of all, let's go to that reference PDF again. And if we scroll down here, we should see a couple of commands which we can use. In fact, here we can use the ng-generate. Then we have to provide a type, which in this case is the component, and then the component name. We can also use that alias g, which is a bit shorter. So let's do an ng-g component, and let's call it people list. And as you can see, it now created a new folder containing a new component, peoplelist.component. And again, the same structure as we have seen before. Let's just remove here the prefix, which I don't like here really here. And the rest looks quite nice. Also, it added that export directly already in our index.js file, which is quite nice. So we can now go back to our peopleDemo component and import our new component there, such that we can use it. So we have to import that ECMAScript 6 module, peoplelist component. And something that's often forgotten is we also have to add it to the directives property here. This is something that may seem tedious, but it basically allows Angular to know what kind of directives are used within that component and thus do some kind of optimizations. Great, so now let's switch back to HTML, and now here we can basically use our new component by simply using the selector, peoplelist. And if we now switch to our browser, we see that the peoplelist works text gets printed out. So nice, this works. Okay, so let's do more advanced stuff. We enter that component and we basically want to do some data binding here. So we create a people list, an empty array here on top, and in the ng-on-init event, which is basically a lifecycle event, we create a new people array. Let's add some people here, name Yuri, then Jack, and finally Don. Great. Okay, now we can go and reference that people array from within our HTML. So we open up the people list component HTML here. And what we want to do here is basically create a new li list and visualize all of the names of our people. So we create an li element. And here we can use a native directive, the *ng4. And the syntax basically is the following. It's mostly like a for loop. So we use let for declaring a local variable person of people, which is the array of our component. So the star basically indicates that this is a template. So this will get multiplied or duplicated for each record in that array of people. And finally, within the li, we simply reference the local person variable and we print out the .name with the 2 curly braces. If we refresh, we see that our list got printed nicely. Great. So this is not very component oriented, so let's create a component that visualizes a single person. So ngg component person. That creates a new person component. And now we basically want to extract this content here and move it inside our person. So we go into the person component and let's simply drop out this part here. We don't want to have an external HTML here because it's really simple. So we use the template property instead of the template URL. And we directly write in here our HTML part. And note we use the backticks here, which allow us to have multi-line strings with ECMAScript 6, which is a really nice feature. Finally, we also need to define our person to which we want to bind, then our HTML template. And great so far. Now, obviously, we need a way to pass in that person from outside, because people list basically is the one that holds the people array. So first of all, we go into the people list and import our person component there. Again, we need to reference it in the directives property here. Also, let's adjust here selector. Great. So again, we want to refactor that li to reference a set of person components here. So we basically create a person component here and then we copy over the for loop. So in this way, we now duplicate our person component here for each record in that people array. And now, as mentioned, we need a way to pass in that person into our person component. Because, as mentioned, the people list here is within our person list, within our people list, basically. And we can do this by using an input binding. And this is done by the square brackets. And we give it a name, which is in this case person. And then we pass in the local variable person to that person input binding. So if you now jump back to our person component here, we have to first of all import the input property or decorator here from Angular 2 core. And then we decorate our person property here with that input in front. And this basically tells Angular that this kind of property is passed from the outside into this component. Great. So now let's switch back to Chrome and we can see how our list is now nicely rendered. So we don't have the li list here, but we have a set of person components which renders out paragraphs with the name of the person inside. Okay, let's continue to add some features. Like we want to modify our person when we click on it. So first of all, we add an input control type text here. And then we can use the ng model with quite a special syntax, which does a two-way binding to the person.name. Like if we switch back to the browser and now type into the text box, we see that the two values are synchronized, which is really a nice feature. Now, obviously we don't want to do that always, but just if we are in editing mode. So let's add here a local property is editing and set it to false by default. And then we want to hide this, and we can do this by using the star ngf directive, which is also a built-in directive within Angular 2. And we basically only show this div whenever is editing is true. And then we can add an event on our p element here. And notice we use the round brackets here for registering to native DOM events. Like the click is a native DOM event, and whenever the user clicks here, we want to set the is editing to the inverted value. So basically we toggle the value of is editing. Let's quickly test this. So if we click on that P, we see that the text box comes in and goes out. Nice. As an addition, we can also very easily bind to like keystrokes. So what we want to do is if the user writes into the text box and presses the enter key, it should automatically save and switch to editing mode. So we can do this again by using the round brackets and register to the special event keydown.enter and again perform the same operation. Is editing equals not is editing. Great, and it seems to work perfectly. Great, so this was quite easy. So now let's add a feature to remove the person. So whenever we click a button, we want to remove that person from the entire array. So let's add a button here. Add a simple X, and now let's refresh. Okay, that doesn't align very nicely. So again, let's wrap this into a div, or better, let's wrap this into a P. Move in and change this here to a label. Okay, so this should lay out a bit nicer here. Great, awesome. So we have our buttons. Now obviously we need to do something when we click the button. And as before, we add a click event here. Click equals, then we invoke a function delete person. And obviously that function needs to be implemented, and we do that in our person component. So delete person, and that's it. Now we have kind of a problem, because we want to delete the person, but the person doesn't live within our component, but it lives within the array defined in a people list component. So what we would have to do is basically to, whenever we click on the button, we have to remove the component from our parent component, the people list component. So it's basically an output. And that's also what we do. We import output and event emitter from Angular 2 core. And then we define a new output. Let's call it onDeletePerson. And the type of this output is an event emitter object of type any. And finally, now if the delete person function is invoked, we basically emit an event and pass on the event the person, which we want to delete. So this onDeletePerson.emit this.person. Great. So we can now jump back to our people list component, and we can now add our onDeletePerson function, and we do that in the same way because it's now an event we defined. So we also use the round brackets for registering to that event. Awesome. So now we can go to the class and define there an onDeletePerson function again, and we will get past the person here as a parameter. And now it's basically plain JavaScript. We simply remove from our people array the kind of person which matches the same name in this case. So very dummy logic, but it works for our simple example. All right, so let's test it out. If we now click the X beneath Jack, it gets removed successfully from our array. So that works. Great, as a next step, what we want to do is to define a service. A service is basically the location where you do the business logic of your application. Like, we don't want to have an array of people defined within our component, but we rather want to retrieve that from somewhere. As you can see, it's a plain ES6 class with injectable decorator on top. Now we define a getAll function in here, and we simply copy over the people array from our component and return it here. Great. So now we need to reference that people service over again at our people list component. So let's jump back to our people list component. And first of all, we have to import our new people service, which we do just like we did with the other kind of constructs like the other person component. Great. And now in the constructor, we define the dependency to that people service component. So the dependency injection mechanism will basically provide us with an instance of this people service. Afterwards, we can also then invoke that new getAll function and remove our static array. And great. But for this dependency injection mechanism to work, we also have to register our people service as a so-called provider. And this is necessary for Angular to understand the scope of our service. So basically the service will be provided by the dependency injection mechanism from this people list component downwards. And obviously we can also define that service application-wide. And in this moment we would provide it in the bootstrap function in the main TS file. Great, so this should work now. Let's quickly test it out by refreshing the application in the browser. And as you can see, it still works. Awesome. Now finally, let's fetch the data from a remote resource. So I go in the public folder and create a new folder called data. And then we define a new file, people.json. Now obviously, in a real world scenario, this would be sent down by some remote server. Now to use the HTTP feature, we need to make sure that we have the Angular 2 HTTP library reference in our package.json. And then we have to go into our main file and import the HTTP providers. These are basically services which we want to have globally available on our application. So we import them here and we pass them directly to the second parameter of our Bootstrap function, which is an array which takes in some custom providers. Great. Now let's switch over to the people service. And at the very top, we import the Angular HTTP service. Again, just as usual, we reference it in the constructor such that the dependency injection mechanism can provide them to us. And then we can use that API. So we can actually refer to it by using this.http.get. And our file should be served over data.people.json. Let's have a look. Yep, works. So we have to provide that path within our file here. And then we basically use the new feature of the HTTP service, which is an observable collection. So we have to map it to JSON. And for this to work, we also have to import the according RxJS operator, which in this case is the map operator. Awesome. Now this library comes from the RxJS library, which we should have referenced here by default in the package.json. Perfect. So for now, that should work. Now, since this is now asynchronous, we also need to adjust our reference here in our people list component. So we cannot reference it directly to this.people because this.people is an array in this case. So let's use the subscribe function provided by our observable that gets returned here. So we directly refer to it by using the people variable, and then we assign it to our local array. Awesome. So let's refresh our application. And it works perfectly. Now, to make sure it is actually being loaded over the network, we can open the Chrome DevTools quickly and refresh the application. And now if we search for people, we should actually get the JSON file. Yep, we see it down here. And here is the data basically that is served over the HTTP channel. Now, the subscribe function, as well as here the map function which we use and the RxJS operator, may seem a bit strange to you initially. And this is what is called reactive programming, and which Angular 2 is heavily adopting, as well as other frameworks like React and so on. So here we have an awesome article from Anders Stahls, which is a really expert in reactive programming, where he gives basically an introduction of how reactive programming works with illustrations and samples. A really in-depth article here, which I really recommend you. And the same article is basically also available at egghead.io in form of video tutorials. So you may want to check out this as well. Then Gerard Sanz has written a nice introduction to reactive extensions for Angular 2 on Medium. And finally, another gist here, which I find really useful, is the RxJS operators by example. And this gist basically lists all of the different operators of RxJS with according examples and demos and links to the official docs, which is a really, really valuable resource. Great. So as a final step, what we could do here is to use basically type annotations. So as you can see, although I've used TypeScript, I haven't really used types here heavily. So let's simply add an example. Let's define an interface, although we could also define a class here of our person, and it has a property name, which is a string. Also, we can import the Rx observable here and annotate our getAll function that it returns an observable of type person. We can then go to our person component and import our new person interface definition. And then we can annotate basically, for example, our input, which is of type person, as well as on the onDelete person event emitter is an event emitter of type person. And also here. And this basically assures also that we use the right types in the mid function. Like you can see now, we can only provide of type person here, and we will get an error if we don't do so, which is really the power behind TypeScript after all. Then let's go back to the people list component and import the person interface here as well. Then here we can add the person array annotation. And down here we see actually an error, which is shown to us by TypeScript. Oh, we probably defined this wrongly. In fact, we have an observable of a person list in this case, so of a person array. Now if you go back, it should be fine. Perfect. And obviously the demo still works, although we added the type definitions here. Awesome. Great, so I think this should have given you a very, very rough overview of how you can create an Angular application. And if you want to play around with this, I have the source code or a similar source code example here on my GitHub repository, which is basically a demo I gave at a talk at a local meetup group. And also, if you want to dive deeper, especially on directives and components, I've created a video series with PactPub, which goes deeper into the component and directives constructs within Angular 2. So you basically learn how to set up a TypeScript and SystemJS environment. I even show you how to upgrade from Angular 1 to Angular 2. We will define reusable components by understanding how the data flows in and out, and we will also take a look at debugging Angular 2 components and automated unit tests and much, much more. Great, so I hope this was useful.